Hello, I'm Papa Biceps, you're watching the Thorin YouTube channel, and remember, don't fuck with Papito.
The major qualification system for CSGO is a fucking joke. It's legitimately hard to think of a worse format for qualifying to the World Championship in any other major esports title contrasted to CSGO. Now, this wasn't as big a deal in the past, in the early days of CSGO, because at that time we were happy just to have majors, just to have an official Valve World Championship with more money put in and more professionalism brought to the scene and a way to bring all the fans together to watch these tournaments. And in the early days, there were less good teams and therefore, or fewer good teams. Therefore, it was a lot more certain that the top teams would qualify, would already be in the major and therefore get their spot next time. Even when you had online qualifiers, it was very unlikely that some underdog no-name team was going to be out of top side. But now that we've got all this parity at tier 2, tier 3, and now we see that when you go to online play, even tier 4 and tier 5 teams can beat sides that they would almost certainly never beat online. And that is the key aspect there, because some of the qualification components mean that we need to tune up how we qualify for these tournaments if we want to have the best teams at them and have the best Counter-Strike. First of all, let's look at how you qualify for a CSGO major. So we'll start from the top down in terms of the qualification system and who's qualifying where. So we start with the legends. So the top 8 teams from the last major automatically qualify for the next major and therefore are guaranteed a top 16 spot because they start in what's called the legends stage or whatever it was called. Then you have the challengers from the last major. So that's the teams that placed 9th to 16th are guaranteed to get into the next major and therefore guaranteed a top 24 spot, and they are joined at that point in where the major begins by the top 2 teams from each of the minors that make up the other 8 teams to go along with the 8 teams that we've got, and therefore you have the challenger stage. Does that make sense, actually? I think so. Then you go to the minor, and in the minor, first of all, in the past, you used to automatically qualify for the minor just by dropping down from the major, going out in last place in the major. Now, the minor is all qualifier. So in Europe, we have a different system, but it used to be from last stage of the major. Now, you automatically get perhaps into the closed qualifier or something in similar like that, but you have teams invited to the closed qualifier, and in the closed qualifier itself, though, you also have online open qualifiers, and the closed qualifiers online as well. And then the teams that get out of that, I think it's 8 come out of that, go to the minor, and they play at the minor, and then the top 2 from each of the minors, so for NA, EU, Asia, CIS, go to the major for the first round. Now, first of all, the biggest problem with this system, the most obvious one that leaps off the page, is that you'll notice when I was describing how you make it there, you either just straight up qualify this time, or you make it based on your placing at the last major. Well, part of the issue there is no tournament results aside from the last major and the current qualifiers and minor for this major have any consideration, can affect how you get into this major or not. So let's look at some of the flaws of that. So again, we'll start at the top. Legend spots auto-qualifying you means you're going to get bad teams who make it to future majors who were good or played well at one major, but are far from a good team, far from an elite team, certainly, and yet are getting an auto invite, automatically getting into the one of the deeper parts of the other major. So in the last major, 2 obvious names come to mind. Virtus.pro, they'd already massively dropped off after that major, had numerous tournaments where they were coming last place, making no playoffs whatsoever. If you were living in a world where you were inviting the top 8 teams or going on a circuit point system, they would never be able to qualify at the stage that they came into the last major. Big, likewise, same scenario. They managed to get a top 8 at the PGL Krakow. Congrats to them. That shouldn't automatically get them the equivalent of what's like an invite or a circuit point top 8 spot and get straight into the next major. Many more teams, much more worthy of that, won tournaments, had numerous top placings, came into the tournament in much better form. Most obvious one from this most recent major was Quantum Bellator Fire, a team that barely scraped into the top 8 anyway, but has done nothing on LAN, literally nothing at any notable LAN since then, has just sat back doing fuck all, can't even qualify to half these LANs, wouldn't get an invite because they're not a top team, and yet they are automatically into this major, while a team like NIP, who won a big tournament in IEM Oakland, is battling to come through the online qualifier just to get to the minor, and you have other good teams who are hoping to get from the first stage into the stage where they can then meet Quantum Bellator Fire, who again have done nothing since the last major. So one of the big problems here is this system actually doesn't even ensure the world's best teams, the top 3 to 4 to 5 teams even make it. They often do, because in most cases, they're so good that they're either going to be in the top 8 last major, and that's how consistent Counter-Strike can be, or they're so good they're going to make it through the qualifier. But think about this. At the last major, E-League Boston, FaZe, the team who was 1 round from winning the tournament and who was considered either number 1 or number 2 in the world. In fact, by the time the major came, they were ranked number 1 because obviously they'd won ECS that had really broken the tie with them and SK. FaZe had to qualify from that new challenger stage, which was the old qualifier for the major, which got tacked on as the first week of the major. The major is now 3 weeks instead of 2. FaZe had to qualify through that despite being the number 1 ranked team in the world, being a team that had won 3 notable international tournaments, had placed top 2 at 5 international tournaments, and this is all since the major before. So they are the perfect example of a team who shouldn't have to be qualifying from some earlier stage. If you're going to have invites and invite people to the top 16 portion of the tournament, they should automatically be there. That should be no questions. But in this system, that does not exist. All because when they had their previous lineup, which was 40% different, they'd gone out in last place at the previous major, PGL Krakow, when it didn't have the new challenger stage. It was just a top 16 and they'd gone out at that point in time. So they just automatically qualified for the top 24 or whatever it would be. 6 months prior. Now, one of the other problems here is once you move past the elite teams, you have solid teams who are gaining nothing from their performance in between and are getting punished based on just their previous results. So at this particular minor, NIP should already automatically be qualified into that minor, at the very least, because this is a team that's had some okay performances, some playoff performances, but they won a big international tournament at IEM Oakland, beating numerous top teams, in fact the 2 best teams in the world at the time, SK Gaming and FaZe. They did all of that, and that doesn't even get them into a minor. Like in a world in which you can use invites and circuit points, what, they wouldn't even be in the minor? Of course they would be. But no, they have to go through the online closed qualifier and play against the likes of Fragsters and teams you've never, Team 5, squads that you might never have heard of and have done fuck all on any of those lands, never even attended any of these big lands, and they have to battle them. Meanwhile, Quantum Bellator Fire did nothing since the last major, is just chilling and they're going to be top 16 automatically. Doesn't really seem that reasonable, does it, when you consider it that way? Then you look at the fact that because they have to go through an online qualifier, it becomes even harder to qualify, even more risky and precarious, because online Counter-Strike already, as I've mentioned many times, is very different to LAN Counter-Strike. Teams that are the undisputed best in the world, who would never lose a certain match on LAN, can absolutely lose it online. It has happened numerous times in many EPL and ECS seasons. Then you go and you look that because you're online, and online people don't have the same pressures, they don't have nerve issues, they're playing from home, it makes the teams too good who are actually the scrub teams. All of a sudden, there's way too many squads that are good. And hence, that's why it doesn't have to be that the good team that doesn't make it is shit and this other team's shit, and therefore that's why. Well, online, obviously, the online team who would never do anything online aren't shit, are they? They're all right, they're decent, they're good. So the big problem here is, it's entirely logical that way too many pretty decent Tier 3, bordering on Tier 2, some bordering on Tier 1, good teams, the Nips, the Heroics of this world, sometimes don't make it to these lands. Some of the top Polish sides don't make it to the major, but who almost certainly would if they were already in a LAN minor, who almost certainly would if they had a chance to maybe qualify as one of the last spots. There are too many good teams that have failed for it to be that it's just NIP and that they're just a meme when it comes to the online qualifiers for the minor, which, okay, they are in their own way. Then you've got to ask yourself, how is it then fair that in Europe, where admittedly we get at least invites to a close qualifier, but Europe, the region that has the most teams trying to qualify, has way better Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 teams than all the other regions. So now having the same number of slots for Europe doesn't make as much sense. Having to go through this massive gauntlet battle of all these teams that could beat you. Meanwhile, in NA, you're cruising to some of these minors. You're cruising through these things. If you're in Asia, it is literally the easiest region to ever qualify through. That's why Renegades is at every motherfucking major at this point in time. They wouldn't beat necessarily some of the squads online if they had to play in an online closed qualifier that NIP's playing right now. That's far from a given, but they don't have to. How is that fair? Then you've got to look at the fact that That makes regions skewed as to how you qualify. Now, one of the things I used to love about the early CSGO majors, especially once we had the LAN qualifier, and the LAN qualifier wasn't based on region, but you fed into it eventually when you got the minors later, is that it made it so that you just got the best teams at the major largely. And sometimes that meant teams you wouldn't have thought. Like you got Fallen's Kaboom squad qualified over some teams like Dignitas that you would have thought were better. You get some good squads, Vega Squadron in recent years who qualify over some of the other teams. Whereas now, in a world where Europe's so hard and so difficult qualification-wise, meanwhile, regions like Asia are piss easy to get through, CIS minor, you end up with a scenario where you're not necessarily going to get the best teams there because the team's going to come out of the CIS minor who's probably not as good as some of the teams who didn't even make it out of the EU minor. You're going to have teams who come out of the Asian minor, especially in past years, admittedly maybe not this one, who would be much worse than the teams that might not make it out the NA and the EU minor. So there are issues here in terms of the qualification mode. Now let's look at the shit teams, because that's another problem, right? You have teams like Quantum Bellator Fire, already discussed, they're already at the major. They've done nothing. Vega Squadron, not only have they done very little since the last major, they've even lost their best player. They're in a scenario where if someone was inviting a team, you'd never invite them. They've done nothing. If you had a circuit point system, they would never make it. Meanwhile, NRG over in North America, team who was in the final of Star Ladder International Tournament, team that was top 4 at ECS Season 5 International Tournament, they're playing in the minor. Again, what? They're not a better team. They haven't accomplished more in the last few months than Quantum Bellator Fire and Vegas Squad. Is there anyone who would dispute that? Again, people will always say, but if you're using invites and these systems, who determines these things? Well, I don't know a human being in the world who would claim that Vegas Squadron and Quantum Bellator Fire have done more since the last major than NRG has. So let's look at other esports, and you'll see that I'm not exaggerating when I say that for a major esport, this is one of the worst systems in the entire world right now, especially in the modern day. So let's look at League of Legends. In League of Legends, what you have is you have these major regions. And in the major regions, you get 3 slots usually for LMS, which is the Taiwan, like Hong Kong area. You get 2, okay. But you get these major slots. And so for in the major regions of like North America, Europe, China, Korea, you get a scenario where I think it's the team that wins the summer tournament automatically qualifies. The team that has the most circuit points and isn't the summer champion automatically qualifies. And then the third way that you determine another qualifier is after the circuit point champion's been decided and the summer champion's been decided, the teams that are left over, like 3, 4, 5, and I think 6, do a gauntlet qualifier where like 6 plays 5 and the winner of that plays 4 and the winner of that plays 3. And then whoever wins that gauntlet is the last team to qualify. So what's great about the system in League of Legends is that you've got 3 different ways to qualify for the World Championship if you're a really good team. And you know what? If you can't win the summer split, so basically the last big tournament before in your region before the World Championship, okay, you got another chance. Did you make it on circuit points over the 2 splits? If you still haven't made it then, you'd be very hard pressed to ever claim you were the best team or even one of the top 2 teams. But let's say somehow you were amazing and you were 3rd or 4th the whole way through, but you didn't qualify yet. You've now got the gauntlet where you're going to play the teams that are below you in the circuit points. And if you can't beat them at that point in time, you know what? You probably don't deserve to beat the World Championship. Like, it seems unreasonable by any metric. I know the word deserve is very loaded, but when you look at those factors out, if you can't get through those 3 totally different ways to qualify, you'd be hard pressed to really complain and say it was unfair that you weren't at the World Championship at that point in time. Then you go and you look at Dota 2. Now, the old system, which I was a big fan of, was first of all, you had a few teams got invited and they reduced the number of invites over the years as the circuit got bigger and you had more tournaments and more established legitimate international tournaments and competition to judge who the best teams were at. So you had invites and those would be based usually on general performance. So teams that won a bunch of big events, of course, got invited first. Then teams who had lots of seconds and thirds, they got invited. And then what you'd have is you'd have a qualifier for each major region. And the winner of each of those qualifiers got into the TI, the international, and then they even had a really cool feature, I thought, which I can see why they got rid of it because they've got more slots now for certain regions, but I loved it. It was the last chance qualifier. And what they did is in those regional qualifiers, the team that placed second in each of the regions, North America, China, Europe, would get to go Southeast Asia would get to go to TI as well. And before TI began, they would play a mini tournament themselves, a qualifier. And the winner of, I can't remember if it was the winner of the top 2 from that. I think might have been top 2, but I know the winner certainly came from that last chance qualifier and got the last spot or last 2 spots in the actual international. And that was actually significant because if you ever remember 2015, the one that Evil Geniuses won, the team that they beat in the final, the team that had defeated them in the upper bracket final and finished second at the international, was CDEC, a team that actually came out of that last chance qualifier. So you never would have seen them at the international if the last chance qualifier part hadn't existed. Now, so again, there was 3 different ways to qualify in Dota. You could be invited, you could get the qualifier spot, or you could come through the last chance qualifier by at least placing top 2 and then winning out this last qualifier against the multiple regions. And the good thing about the last chance qualifier is it actually showed which region really deserved another slot instead of just artificially, arbitrarily giving it to the slots and then hoping that the regional shift region balance doesn't shift massively before the next international. Now, the current system they're using is somewhat similar. You get 8 invites from circuit points. So all the Dota tournaments in the world, majors or minors, and they contribute a certain amount of circuit points. And when you come to the TI, they've invited the top 8 teams that were placed top 8 in terms of overall circuit points. Then you have the top 8 other teams come from regional qualifiers where they've actually divided up different slots. I think NA gets the most, China gets 2. They divided it up differently, and then you get the other teams come from those. So considering these much better solutions, I'm going to take some elements of these and say how I think we should do it in CSGO, but I'll give you 3 different versions as to how I think you could do it, all of which I think would be an improvement over the current method. Because like I say, I think the current method is one of the worst you could possibly conceive. So, well, okay, for the sake of devil's advocate, I guess just having no qualifiers based on anything and just having one massive open online bracket would be worse than what we currently have. But of the major esports, it's by far the worst. So here's the simplest fix to the major qualification system I would suggest. I would have some panel of experts or some commissioner or some community liaison person, hopefully informed by experts, look at the tournament results since the last major and this one, and say 2 months out from the next major, he comes out and he invites the top 8 teams in the world and he says, you're all invited to the next major. And that's based on your results at those tournaments. So there's a little bit of, you're going to have to figure out which one do I weigh more. But the whole point of this is, worst case scenario, if you're inviting 8 teams, you know what, maybe 1 or 2 of them are a bit borderline. Like, I should have invited Gambit over Heroic, whatever the particular scenario is. Or maybe NIP shouldn't have gotten in there. Actually, I see this other team's had a bit of a run recently. Maybe NRG, maybe they should be in there. Sure, there might be 1 or 2 that were borderline or considered wrong by some people. But let's be real. Almost every single era of Counter-Strike, the top 5 or 6 is going to instantly be absolutely correct and completely verifiable by the results. Like, there's going to be no argument over the top 5, let's be real. Then you've got the scenario where I would give the other 8 spots to the minors. And I would give out different numbers of slots, though, depending on regions. I think EU would probably get 3 or 4, NA would get 1 or 2, Asia would maybe get 1, CIS would get 1. You know, you do something like that until the regions had proven themselves that they deserved more slots. Now, that's the simple one, because it just involves you invite based on your own criteria, then you have the minors and you give different number of slots. Now, here's a medium complexity one, which evolves the concept, but has a little bit more tricky elements to it. So the medium complexity aspect is to have, instead of invites based on a circuit point system. So now, the problem with this is you would have to get the tournament organizers together with Valve. Valve would have to determine which tournaments count for circuit points, which count for the most circuit points. Are they all even number of circuit points? Are there majors? Are there minors in terms of who gets the most circuit points? That's where it's going to get a little bit more tricky. But you know what? Someone can figure that out, as it has been done in Dota 2 and in other games. And then you could maybe even have it where there's a commissioner again, and he grants status to tournaments every couple of months, because you don't always know the tournaments in advance, right? That's another issue in Counter-Strike. But let's say every 2 to 3 months he says, right, in the next 3 months, here are the tournaments that are going to be this status. There's another factor you can do. Admittedly, yes, tournaments have invites, etc. But the invites themselves tend to generally be based on how well the teams are doing. They're not just arbitrary entirely, except for the odd team that gets invited who's just like the local team. And even then, that doesn't mean they're going to place highly and get circuit points, right? Then you've got a scenario where I would give out I'd probably give the last 4 slots to the minors, and I'd have like the circuit points decide the top 12, because the circuit's going to do a better job than just raw minors. So in this scenario, I'd have the circuit points invite 12 or 16 teams if we're going to have a 2014 major, and then I'd have the last 4 slots just come from the winner of each minor. That would be my approach. The very complicated version, and I'll make this very quick, would be I'd pick like 4 really big tournaments. And I'd say that the winner of each of these tournaments gets an invite to the major. And if obviously one team wins more than one slot, then it goes to another one of these slots goes to the circuit point system. The circuit point system would then invite the next 4 to 8 teams, depending on how many you want to do. So that we're getting champions, and then we're getting the next best teams as well anyway, determined by the circuit. Then we have a minor/qualifier system for the last 4 to 8, whatever it might be, to make up the major. Now, another benefit to my system, by the way, it would also put less pressure on the whole 3 out of 5 system, because you see with teams like G2, it puts an undue stress on how you then make your roster moves, which can then change the whole direction of your franchise, your squad, for years to come, where you might have made an upgrade now and then gone on and win a load of tournaments and prove that you were amazing, but now you've got to keep at least 3 to keep that slot, because nothing from last major until now counts except what happened at the last major. So it freezes the scene and how you make roster moves and who can go where and do what with their careers in a way that's very artificial and arbitrary and doesn't really seem to yield that many positives. It does in as much as you don't want to let teams just go willy-nilly and completely change their whole lineup right before the major, but then go, hey, but my organization did qualify 6 months ago. Sure, it's a solution to a problem Valve created. I'm saying get rid of the problem and you don't need this solution. You can have a different solution to a much lesser problem overall, because teams will have done something in the meantime with their new lineup. Then you have the scenario that you've now arrived in a middle ground. So you don't want a system that is fully open. If everyone had to qualify from scratch for every major, I guarantee you there'd be some world-class top 5 teams in the world would go out in the online portion, or one of them would go out in the minor as well, and then one of them get upset in the first round. All sorts of things could and would happen, as we saw with FaZe at the PGL Krakow, as we've seen with NiP and Heroic and some of the minors in the past, as we've seen with some very good squads at minors themselves. You had the Envious squad at one of the last, at the PGL Krakow ones, an obvious one where they looked like easily the best team coming into the minor, didn't even get out of the minor. So you'd get a lot of teams this would happen to, and they'd get wrecked. Then you go the other way. You go to a fully closed system where you just invite all the teams and there's nothing that can be done in terms of open qualifiers. That sucks as well, because now if a team does come along like the Kaboom team back in 2015, or like a Vega Squadron in 2016, 2017, or like Quantum Bellator Fire, and they really can battle their way through some kind of qualification system, then cool. We want them to be able to potentially get into the major, but we want it that most of the slots are determined by the circuit, so we know who the best teams are and they get there. And then if these other teams, as another way of qualifying, can get through there, not from invite or circuit points or qualify, if they can get through another type of qualifier in the minor, fair enough, then they can join it and we'll have a couple of slots for that. But also, if they flunk, doesn't matter, we've got the other top 14, 16, 18, whatever teams in the world, and a couple that flail but made it there legitimately is not a big deal. The in-between, which, as you've noticed, either uses a circuit point system or an invite system, people will always ridiculously play devil's advocate and make really unfair false equivalencies by being like, but that's so tricky, isn't it? Because who's going to determine what events are the big circuit points, and who's going to be the one who picks the invites? And they say this as though we're picking a random person out the crowd and he's just going, well, I love NIP and I love Virtus Pro and I love Existence, get him in there. That's not what would be happening. We'd be picking either an expert to do it, and again, I don't care who the expert is. Make the guys from HLTV.org do it. I trust that they'll pick the top 5 to 6 teams without fail. Whether they'll do 7 or 8, maybe I'd disagree, but it'll be a better system than we have right now. In terms of having an actual commissioner decide the circuit point things, the good thing is, even if he's a bit wonky with which tournaments he gives the circuit points to, as long as the teams know, then the best teams in the world can make sure they hit certain events and attend certain events, and therefore perform well enough that they'll get their circuit points and they'll qualify as well. There's much, much less wiggle room and margin for error to fuck up with this system than the one we currently have. And even ignoring some of these aspects, Csgo's system is so much worse than other big esports titles. This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, and a special thanks to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to get teasers for my upcoming work? Find out who's coming next, what topics are being discussed? Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear on one of my shows or in one of my videos? Would you like to ask a question in my monthly Patreon AMA, or perhaps even discuss esport as part of a discussion show I run on a monthly basis? Donators can also discuss the topics expounded upon in my videos with me and the other patrons on our Patreon page. All of this and more at the Patreon link below.